Okay, we're live. Hi, everyone. We are Sunflowers and Red Feathers. I'm Christina.
And I'm Stephanie. We are two moms living in the before and after of child loss.
Join us in this journey as we share our stories of not only loss, but how life after loss can still be full of beauty, love, hope, and joy.
Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on when we post a new video.
Bye. Bye.
Hey everyone, we are Sunflowers and Red Feathers. I'm Stephanie.
Hi, and I'm Christina. Thanks for joining us today. Today is a special podcast episode for us. We are doing another interview, part of our interview series. And today we have Kendra Rinaldi, who is another fellow podcaster. And her podcast is called Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between. So we'll give you a little backstory, and then we're going to ask Kendra some questions. So Kendra is... she is a fellow griever. She lost her sister, who was 19 years old when she was 21. And then 4 years ago, she also lost her mother to pancreatic cancer. So she is all too familiar with grief, and since has decided to start her own podcast, which started last March, so almost a year into it now. And she is definitely more of a pro than we are. But we're so thankful to have her with us today and get some insight, because she's interviewed not just grief parents, but spouses, friends, and anybody really in their grief journey. So we're really thankful to have her insight today. So Kendra, thanks for being here. And do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you started your podcast?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for having me, by the way. And I feel like the stuffing on an Oreo, like I'm like right sandwich between the two of you guys. I like the little stuffing. So a double, what is it? Double stuffed Oreo. So, love it. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here. And I'm also just so grateful that you guys are doing similar work than what I do. And it's so funny because when I started doing the podcast, it was because I was seeing that there was a need for this, and therefore I created it. But I did not know how many people also were doing the same thing. So as I started doing the podcast, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a common thread. There's several of us that are wanting to have these open conversations about grief. And I love it. I love the community that I've been able to meet and the people I've been able to meet. So a little bit about myself. You shared a little bit about my grief journey. So are you hearing an echo, or is it okay right now?
I don't hear it.
So you shared a little bit about my grief journey. So yes, my sister passed away in 1996. I was 21. She died in a car accident. So I've experienced sudden death. And then 10 years after that, I actually had a miscarriage. And that was in my first pregnancy was a miscarriage. So I experienced that type of loss as well. And that was, I would have not imagined being able to grieve somebody that I didn't even know would hurt so much. So that was in 2006. And then in 2016, my mom passed away from pancreatic cancer. So, and that was a slow process, but short to some extent as well. So I've experienced just the different types of grief. So in my journey of why it is I created, was that the question you asked me? Why I created the podcast, or about myself?
Yeah, why you started the podcast,
So why I started the podcast was more like I was already being a grief facilitator for a nonprofit organization, and I was hearing all these different stories of people and their grief journey. And in my own journey, realizing that when somebody has tools to navigate grief, it just makes it a little bit easier. It's like going to the beach and making sure you have the surfboard if by chance there's a tide and you need to hop on that wave, like it's just a tool. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be waves. You just have the tools to navigate through them. And one of the things that I would see was a common thread in the people that I either see in the facilitating group or just even between my friends and my family was that's those that had something to hold on to, like faith, um, some type of belief, had an easier time navigating that grief. So my curiosity kind of came in as well, of like just wondering, like, I wonder what different people with different beliefs and backgrounds and different types of grief, how they navigate their grief. So that was one of the reasons I started the podcast, was my own curiosity, as well as providing a tool for somebody else that was going through a grieving journey.
Okay. And have you found that people that you have interviewed on your own podcast have listened to other podcasts and found tools like that?
Yes. Yeah. Like, I believe that a lot of times when people find a podcast, they were kind of just jumped around. So either people find it in podcasts or in YouTube videos that they see, or books. I think one of the biggest tools has definitely been people having a community, friends, family. That's one of the biggest tools I see in common, people having. And I think that when they reach out to either find a podcast or find another community of people that have experienced a similar loss, is because they're needing that relatability, somebody else that has gone through something similar as they have, to be able to say like, oh, okay, this is normal. It's normal for me to be, feeling this way, like, so, because it's like, even within your friends and family, sometimes even if you're experiencing the same grief, you're all experiencing different. So you may feel like, oh, am I the only one that is feeling like this way and feeling so like submerged in my grief? But then when you hear somebody else's story that they were also very submerged in their grief, then you're like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know much about Stephanie and I's story, but we didn't really have anybody. We didn't have community at first besides each other. And so that's one of the reasons why we started Sunflowers and Red Feathers, is because we found that community in each other and really bonded over our grief as friends. And so I totally understand what you're saying. And if you don't have that, if you don't know somebody else who's in the same situation, that can be really hard. Were you something, Stephanie?
I lost my mom when I was 21. I was in college. And so I didn't know anyone else that didn't have a mom at the time. And I went into a dark place there. This would have been really helpful for me. So I love the work that you're doing. That's great.
Ditto to you guys. Yeah. And I feel that there's that relatability, right? Like when people are listening to your podcast or listening to mine, because we've gone through it as well, it's some type of shape or form of grief, even if it's not the same type as the listener. Again, they can relate to it, and we're not just like scientists or psychologists kind of like stating you go through this stage and this stage and like all these facts. It's like really feeling it. And I think that that's what makes it a little different to have these type of platforms.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. I mean, I went to school for grief counseling. And so I went after my mom passed away, I was going to be a grief counselor. I worked for hospice. I knew all those stages. I knew what grief was, right? And then I lost my kid, and all that went out the window completely because none of that was relevant. There's no steps to grief when it comes to any of this, really. So,
Stephanie, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know that you had studied grief counseling.
Yeah, did that until I started having babies. Mom, there we go. But have you ever interviewed a bereaved parent before in your podcast?
Yeah, several. Yeah. So I've released about 40 something episodes, but interviewed, I mean, I have a few episodes I haven't released yet. Oh my gosh, there's more. At least I've interviewed, I don't know, 6 bereaved parents probably, or so.
Oh, wow.
At least, I think. I'd have to probably look through go like this and scroll. Yeah, so no, there have been several bereaved parents I've interviewed.
Well, since our podcast is mainly for bereaved parents, how do you feel that a bereaved parent's grief has been either the same or different than other losses, such as siblings or parents?
So I'm going to say this right now, not as a podcast host, but as a grief facilitator. The organization I facilitate in is a nonprofit organization, and we actually separate each group by the type of loss. And but I happen to have the group that is Spanish speakers, and therefore in that group of adults is all the types of grief within it instead of separated. So I have already been navigating the journey of facilitating when people are talking, when they have different griefs, like grief, death of a child or death of a spouse or a friend. And one of the things that that I'm kind of always making sure that the people that are sharing know is that all their grief is that you can't put a category into it. It's like, oh, mine is bigger than yours. There could be somebody that lost their dog, and that for them is like, there could be somebody that lost their dog, and that is like the biggest loss ever they've had in their life. So I don't like to put a comparison of that based on who died. It has to do with the individual. So that's the main thing I notice. It has to do is with the person themselves and their own tools and their own, just their own experience with grief, even just in the past.
I totally agree. Christina and I talk about that a lot. There's no way that you can compare somebody's hard to our hard. Like, your grief is your grief. You own that, there's no way you can compare that. So I totally get it. I understand. Yeah. So in your podcast, it's titled, sorry, I'm going to look again really quick. It's titled Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between. Tell us why you want to focus mostly on the gratitude part of it. This is something Christina and I want to focus on, joy and hope, throughout our podcast. And we love that you have gratitude in there. Tell us more about that.
You just even just you sharing that what you guys like to focus on is joy and hope. It's still like, I get emotional just even hearing those words, because especially knowing what you've experienced and just so recently, that I really feel that is the key, is just how do we switch and focus on something else, and it just in order to kind of bring I don't know, balance. I don't like that word, but just to kind of shift it a little bit one way, so that the other one doesn't weigh so hard on us and so heavy on us, because it's going to weigh anyway, right? It's going to be painful. Our grief is so painful, and therefore if we start like kind of pointing the light and putting the focus on the joy that there is in our life, in the gratitude component of it, it just makes it just a little bit less painful. That is really why I like to put it that way. And honestly too, the other thing is that I believe that from every experience we go through, and even particularly, probably mostly even the hard ones, we grow. And in that growth, there's learning. And in that learning, there's aspects of gratitude. So that is kind of what I kind of see in this journey of grief, is that there's gratitude because there's been growth in that process of this hard thing we've gone through. And that gray in between is a big part of it too. The yuck, the yucky feeling, the not wanting to get out of bed, the
no, feeling, I can definitely understand. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'm glad that we asked that question, because like you said, it's really hard to find joy, hope, gratitude in grief. Like, especially in the beginning, I remember the very first time that I laughed after Mason died, I felt so horrible. Like, how am I even able to have any joy at all after my child just died? And I felt, I don't know what the right word is,
like
but
guilty. The word guilty comes to mind when you just said it.
Yeah, you feel guilty for being able to find joy, and then you have this like gray in between phase where you're like a little bit sad, a little bit happy, and then finally you have to just make the decision. For you it was finding gratitude in the journey, and for us it's being able to help people find a hope, and then learning to be joyful through that. And so yeah, we obviously have our gray days that are probably more than there are hopeful and joyful, but that's part of the journey. And and we made a decision to start our podcast and talk about our journey and hope that we can help other people to find hope and joy. So we really appreciate what you do as well, because if you can help people get through those gray days and, have gratitude in the end, that's pretty amazing.
Same with you guys, with the joy.
Thanks.
Love
So
it.
sorry I ran out of there for a few minutes. Did you guys get on to the next question or not?
We were
No,
talking
it's-
about if in terms of having bereaved parents, we talked about that conversation. If by having people on the in the podcast or talking to people that are bereaved parents, if their grief is similar or more, or so I just said that you can't really categorize it. That's what we were talking about before.
Gotcha. Okay, so since you have interviewed so many unique people, do you have any, I guess it's kind of the same question, do you have any other similarities that you've found between people that are grieving, whether it be a spouse or if they lost a child or a friend?
I think that the main thing is people are usually, what we talk about, the tools, the people that have had an easier time navigating their grief has been because they've had set type of tools as they're doing, as they're navigating it. So as I was mentioning before, a lot of times they have their family or friends, or they have their faith. They ground themselves. They kind of find like a grounding point in something, a foundation, right? So that's one of the things that I've noticed very common in I think all the people I interview is that.
Good. That's great, because I think especially if somebody's listening to our podcast right now, that means that they're looking for something to be founded on. And I think the similarity then is a community, whether it just be a grief as a whole, or for bereaved parents, finding your little niche of a specialized foundation. But it sounds like that's where it's at, is just speaking, being able to talk about how you feel and knowing that you're not alone in how you feel. That's definitely something that Stephanie and I have learned through each other.
Yeah.
I love that you brought up faith too, because Christina and I, we met, we started going to a nonprofit group as well. But it was very not religious, like you can't talk about your faith or whatever. And so being able to have sunflowers and red feathers and being able to talk about how our faith helps us has been a big help for me specifically. And so I love that, you can find those tools and you don't have to fit within this little bubble. So I think that's great. But talking about your own podcast, do you have a favorite or most meaningful episode that you would recommend to a bereaved parent right now?
Oh God, that would be like picking your favorite child, right? No, honestly, they're each so unique. So when I'm talking to friends, for example, I have friends that have not listened to my podcast because it's just not.
They don't need it.
They don't, it's just heavy. But I tell them, I'm like, you don't understand how many other things you will learn, even if they've had their own grief experience too. It's not just about that. It's sometimes you have your own grief experience, but it's so heavy that sometimes you don't even hear somebody else tell their story because you're not ready to go there yet. But I say, I'm like, you learn so much from everybody's journey about other aspects of life. It's not just about how to navigate grief. So that is so when I'm sharing an episode with somebody, it may just be based on whatever they've told me in their life. I'm like, I think you could relate to this episode, but you can have to just, find which ones. I would not, even if I've had some of bereaved parents, if somebody's a bereaved parent, I may say, listen to this other one, and it might be about divorce because maybe that particular person said something that related or reminded me of this individual too. So it's really hard to pick.
Yeah, I understand that. And back on what you said about people might not be ready to hear that, I felt like that a lot in the beginning with when we started going to that support group that Stephanie was talking about. We started going with each other kind of as a support, like I'll go if you go kind of thing. And some days it almost felt like a chore. It's like I had finally gotten to a place that I felt like I was good, and then the thought of going to a support group meeting and thinking about everybody else telling their story and being so raw in their grief, like it almost was like a downer. And I didn't some days I didn't feel like I really wanted to go because I couldn't go back there. And so that can be really hard. So it definitely has to be a decision on your own end in your own journey that you're ready to move through it and hear what other people have to say. Because sometimes that means that you're going to cry listening to their story before it can help you. So
and you said a really key word was through it, right? It's not moving past it or what. No,
you don't get over it.
And yeah. Now, do you guys remember that? Did you guys ever see them going on a bear hunt?
Yes.
Did you
can't go
that
over
book
it,
or going on a bear hunt? Yeah.
Let's go through it.
Yeah, you can't go. I think
we have toddlers.
Exactly that way. It's like you have to go through it. Yeah. I used to own a children's gym, so we would do it, but like as a song. Yeah, and so that's why I started singing it instead. Like, we gotta catch a big one. Yeah. And so
that's a daily occurrence at our house.
Okay. Perfect. So I'm getting right in. So and now, of course, I didn't think of it that way when I was teaching the kids, that song, that it had to do with grief. But honestly, it totally can relate. You have to go through it. You really cannot go around it. And so you use that word right there. And I think that it's a lot of times, we're just not ready to go really into it and through it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So since you do your own podcast and you've done it for almost a year now, is there something that has happened during an interview that you didn't expect to happen? Hopefully not bad, but in a good way.
Let me think about that one.
Go ahead.
What I don't expect sometimes, because a lot of the times I'm only finding out about the person's story as I'm interviewing. I very rarely do pre-interviews prior to the podcast itself. So I'm finding out these details just at the same time, per se, as the listener. So there have been times in which certain details of something have caught me off guard and stuff. And so even though I've learned how to be able to compartmentalize, if that's, my accent's coming in what I'm trying to say that, but compartmental, am I saying that right? Compartmentalize. Thank you. Compartmentalize. I'm putting the accent on. Compartmentalize, myself and like just really be more focused on just the interview and kind of remove a little bit of my emotions a lot of times, because I have to also guard myself, right? And protect myself, because when you're hearing people's journey, it's an energy you're taking in yourself too, right? As you're sharing, so as you're listening. So you have to be very mindful of that. And especially as an empath type of personality that I am, I have to be careful with that. So so what it's caught me off guard has sometimes been details that have moved me that I have not been able to kind of just completely guard. So that would probably be most.
I think that's something that we're having to prepare ourselves for, because I'm sure that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Totally get it. So we have your Instagram handle as Grief Gratitude Podcast, but how can people find your podcast to listen?
Thank you. So if you go on the Instagram itself, you can then click there and go to the different podcast links as well. You could go to my website, Grief Gratitude and the gray in between, it's the whole thing.com. Or you can go on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play to listen as well. And hopefully one day I'll have YouTube too, so that I could put some subtitles, so people can read it. The people that are maybe hearing impaired could read the podcast. So that'd be the next plan.
Yeah. Well, we thank you so much for being on our show and sharing a little bit about your podcast. We really wanted to just emphasize and kind of end on the fact that Kendra really, her focus in her podcast is the gratitude, getting through the gray parts of grief. And so if you feel like you're struggling in that gray area and you need some motivation or some tools to help get you through that, definitely take a look at Grief Gratitude and the Gray in Between podcast. So thanks, Kendra, again for being on our show, and we will look forward to continuing watching your journey.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And the friendship. Thank you,
Yes.
ladies. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to have you on my podcast now.
Yeah, stay tuned. That'll be nice. All right.
All right,
Take
thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.